So I'm going to try to get this video happening for y'all. Oh, there, I had it plugged in, Robbie couldn't hear me. It's Friday morning. I am off to the gym, and yesterday afternoon here in Nashville, I went to the press screening for the new Spike Lee film BLACKkKLANSMAN, and I had an insane drive home last night. I was wrong side of town at the wrong time of day. The movie out at about 5:05, of course, so traffic was just insane. But it was the perfect opportunity for me to make one of these, make one of this for y'all. Unfortunately, I lost my signal somewhere along the way, and the whole thing just disappeared into the ether. But I thought I would just go ahead and do this now on my way to the gym. I've got a little bit of a trek to the gym, so I thought I'd go ahead and try to get this uploaded as instantly and as first impressionly as I possibly could. I almost did it last night, but I just didn't have the time in the evening yesterday. So BLACKkKLANSMAN, like I said, it's the new Spike Lee film. It stars John David Washington. I'm not really familiar with him. I may have seen him in other movies before, but I didn't recognize him. I might be fun for not recognizing him because everybody in this movie is decked out in 1970s hairstyles and costumes and it's I don't understand why America's so in love with the 70s, but they are, and they still are, and we've seen so many movies in the last 15 or 20 years that revisit the 1970s. This is another one. It's one of the better ones. It really does a good job of showing us that time period through that lens, not only with the costumes and the hairstyles and styling and makeup and all that stuff, but also in terms of giving us an eye on the culture of that time. And the movie's based on a true story about a black student activists and things like that, who are under the influence of things at that time, which are like the power movement. Okay, this is after the assassinations of MLK and Malcolm X, and now we're to the point where you've got the rise of the Black Panthers and things like that. All power to all the people, the black leather jackets, the berets, the whole 9 yards, right? And he's an ambitious young guy who's not interested in filing reports for the rest of his life. So he says, you guys could be using me, more effectively. I should be a detective. And they're like, well, it's kind of ridiculous for a rookie to be made a detective right away, but you're right, we could use you. So that begins his journey, not only as a young detective, also as a black man struggling with his own race consciousness. He is somebody who's always wanted to be a police officer, and sees a lot of dignity and a lot of good in the work that he's doing. And at the same time, his work brings him into contact with these young radical students who, begin to challenge his point of view about whether or not he can change any. The police in general represent some kind of reprehensible, oppressive force, or, from his point of view, that there are bad, there's some bad eggs in the carton, but there are good people too. And the movie's really interesting. It really it's nuanced, man. And Spike Lee is smart. Spike Lee is one of my favorite filmmakers, and Spike Lee film is Malcolm X, the biopic of Malcolm X starring Denzel Washington. I'll watch that 5 times right now. Okay, I can't even count the number of times I've watched the Malcolm X film. I would say that probably Malcolm X is in my top 10 favorite films of all time. And it's certainly my favorite Spike Lee movie, but he's made a bunch of other movies I like a lot. 25th Hour is great. Earlier movies, you can't really talk about the 1980s in film without talking about Do the Right Thing. So Spike Lee is one of our most important directors. I always equate him, or I always link him in my brain with Oliver Stone. They both sort of came up at the same time. I think Oliver Stone is probably a little older than Spike Lee, given his experiences in the Vietnam War, but not by much. And in cinematic generations, they're very much brothers, because both those guys came out of the New York filmmaking scene. Both those guys were mentored and taught at NYU, I believe, by Martin Scorsese. So they, they both have a very similar place they came out of, and I think it's very interesting that they both also, have made these careers, not entirely, but certainly a significant amount of their work has been based on, to some degree, on real life stories, but also on political themes, social and political themes. Whether we're talking about Malcolm X or Crooklyn, and it didn't get more attention, but that's beside the point. Back to Spike Lee, back to BLACKkKLANSMAN. So with that in mind, with the idea that this is a young guy who comes up from under Martin Scorsese. I'm talking about Spike Lee now. What we know about Scorsese is part of the film kids, the film students movement, right? This was the first time that you had a bunch of kids who had actually gone to school to learn to be filmmakers, who then took over the zeitgeist and became the new face of Hollywood. Literally the best period in film ever, okay, as far as I'm concerned, the American films of the 1970s. And that's when you had filmmakers like Scorsese, like Coppola, like Peter Bogdanovich, like, oh my God, there's so many of them, Altman, all these people who suddenly, Woody Allen, who suddenly just found a crack in the door and were able to get through during a time when the studios were literally failing. And they were like, hey, give this kid $5 million and see what he can do, And then people like Peter Fonda, the Easy Rider is basically the beginning of this whole movement. Peter Fonda is making movies for pennies, and then he, making movies for pennies, and then they turn out to be, giant blockbuster hits like Easy Rider, right? So that was the beginning. The thing to know about all those filmmakers was that they were being influenced by the French cinema that had come the decade before, and of many others. Basically started throwing away a lot of the rules about cinema. Cinema had been a thing where one tried to create a world, an other world, considered to be the height of the art, basically. But these film critics, Godard and Truffaut, were both started off as, you guys don't understand what's going on. You don't even know what's good. So they basically criticized American filmmaking and American film audiences, really, and said, hey, all the filmmakers that you guys think are great, they're not the great filmmakers. The great filmmakers are your genre filmmakers. The great filmmakers are people like Alfred Hitchcock. Hitchcock is a great filmmaker. And in America at that time, Alfred Hitchcock was, considered to be a guy who could really, put one of those thrillers that would make you, check twice before you went into the shower or whatever. But he wasn't considered this great genius. But the French said, no, he is the great genius. He's your great genius. And began to deconstruct, the culture of Hollywood and remake it in their way. And one of the things they did was they basically sort of started using lots of techniques that made it obvious that that the movie wasn't. What am I trying to say? They made you self-conscious of the camera. Okay, so like, how did they do that? Well, in some ways, they they would take when it came to shooting on the street, right? Godard wouldn't get a permit and set up 20 extras and tell this one, okay, you eat that croissant, and you look for a newspaper, and you try to flag down a taxi, and then here comes the girl walking down the street, and we're going to follow her around the corner and make sure the lighting's right, They literally used, I think, a shopping cart or a baby carriage and put a camera in it, and then just went walking down the street and literally just shot documentary footage of the streets of Paris at that time to get these exterior shots. And they're famously underlit and all this other stuff. But it was a wake-up call to cinema. These images were beautiful. And suddenly now, instead of looking at a stage scene in a film, you're looking at just like real life documentary footage that has been, added to a movie. And it's a jarring thing when these films first came out. Well, I say all this. It's too much, by the way. I'm sorry for just this, indulging myself in this film that I find so fascinating. But I say all this because this movie is full of that kind of stuff. This movie is very self-conscious in the best possible ways. And one of the best things about the movie, probably the best thing about the movie for me, is that it is a film that is seeking to illuminate the history of the way black people have been represented by you can call it Hollywood. I mean, it's a little bit earlier than that, perhaps, but by the way that American filmmaking has represented black people throughout history. So there are moments in this film where Spike Lee, starts talking about what is it called? Birth of a Nation, right? The D.W. Griffith film, Birth of a Nation. And the fact that the Birth of a Nation film actually helped to reignite the KKK at one point, which, obviously ties right into the film. And then he gets into the blaxploitation period of the 1970s and manages to have the characters just have a fun conversation about the movies. But because of their perspectives, they're also able to bring in all of this context about, the fact that those movies were fun and cool and stylish and badass and all this kind of stuff. But at the same time, there was also criticisms of those films from the black community, from places like the NAACP. I was recently writing about a blaxploitation film called Black Caesar for my movie column. Those movies were also criticized from within the black community because people saw them as perpetuating stereotypes, that all black people are, drunks or pimps or prostitutes or criminals, well, why don't we see a movie where a black man is a banker or a lawyer or a doctor, So, they managed to work that into this film. The movie opens with one of the most shots in movie history, the shot from Gone with the Wind, where, I'm just gonna leave it at that. I spoiled this big time yesterday when I just told you what the opening shot was. But just believe me, that shot is one of the most famous shots in American film. And it's still one of the most beautiful shots in American film. You can understand the technical difficulties they must have had during the time they made this particular movie, Gone with the Wind. I'll let you know, it's from Gone with the Wind. But the movie just flat up opens with a quote from another film. And man, oh man, I tell you what, I've got goosebumps right now because I am telling you, man, it is such a pleasure. Man, especially nowadays, because it just feels like I watch a lot of movies where I don't have this experience. I suppose it's always been that way, but I watch a lot of movies nowadays. But I don't know if I watch any more than I used to, but I'm watching them more intently because I've got people to write about them, right? So it's such a pleasure to be hands of a master filmmaker like Spike Lee, and that's how you feel in this movie, man. You just feel like, man, somebody has their hand on the wheel and they know what they're doing, right? So the performances are fantastic in this film. The movie, again, let me get back to the plot a little bit. I don't like to hammer these details too much because I really don't want it to be spoiled. I don't want to have any spoilers. But so John David Washington, gets to the point where he takes his chance to be a detective, and immediately he's put in contact with these student radicals to find out what they're doing in terms of, they're are they a danger to Colorado, or, is this merely, just, student kids, on campus, essentially becoming politically activated as young adults. So he starts looking into that and making some contacts within that world. But then he notices a phone number in the newspaper telling people in Colorado Springs, hey, if you're interested in finding out more information about the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, call this number. So it's just a classified ad in the back of the newspaper. So he picks up the phone. He picks up the phone and calls this number. There's actually weird parallels to Sorry to Bother You in this movie, in the sense that you've got the sort of dialogue happening about on the phone or not, because how do black people sound, kind of thing. So there's a funny scene about that. Well, there's kind of a running joke that in this movie. But anyway, he picks up the phone, calls the KKK, tells him he's interested in getting some reading material, and immediately has somebody call him back. In the meantime, he's made a couple rookie mistakes when he does this impulsive thing. And basically now it turns into a thing where he's got the opportunity to infiltrate the KKK, but clearly as a black dude with a big afro, he's got no options, right? You know. So this reminds me, actually, this whole story reminds me of the famous Dave Chappelle skit with the BLACKkKLANSMAN, and I wonder how much that skit was informed by this actual story, you know. And he found another way to tell the tale of a guy who ends up being a black man in a white Klan robe. But anyway, so because John David Washington's character can't possibly, you know, actually go meet with the Ku Klux Klan, he teams up with he teams up with Adam Driver. There we go. I was going to say, what's Kylo Ren's name? So he teams up with Adam Driver. So Adam Driver becomes, you know, the face of this guy who wants to join the Ku Klux Klan. But in the meantime, John David Washington takes all the phone calls, right? So, and then they work on trying to imitate each other. There's a really funny scene, actually, where they're basically trying to imitate each other. And there's actually three guys. There's another detective who's working on this case with them, and they're all basically doing a rehearsal of a script, essentially. It's another beautiful, cool quote in the movie. It's the kind of thing we've seen in Tarantino films, you know, where like in Reservoir Dogs, where they're on top of the roof, and Tim is that his name, Tim? The British actor is trying to memorize his character with his cop partner, right? And he's telling the whole story of being in the bathroom, and he's got the drugs on him and the dog and the cops and all that stuff, and he's doing this whole monologue just like an actor would. There's a scene like that in this movie too that's like cherry, man. It's beautiful just seeing these actors acting like actors within the context of this cop movie. It's fucking awesome, man. I really, really love it. So anyway, this movie's incredibly funny, and let me tell you a little bit more about the plot. So at that point, they infiltrate the KKK. Topher Grace has a great turn here as the young David Duke. For those of you who might not know, David Duke used to be the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, and then he became the National Director of the Ku Klux Klan. Oh, this is good. I should say this. So in the movie, they talk about that, how the Ku Klux Klan is now, you know, trying to be this more legitimate organization with ads in the newspaper and a national director. And the idea is that they are aiming to find their way into, you know, the alleys and the underbelly of political culture, so they can eventually have allies in high office. And one of the cops is talking to John David Washington and makes an allusion to the idea that, you know, until they find someone they can run as president. And it's one of the first times in the movie where Spike Lee starts making these connections to present day, right? Where he starts making these connections to the Trump era, right? And man, I got to tell you, throughout the movie, all of a sudden there'll be like another little web, another little web. For some reason, this was a Spider-Man analogy. And so every now and then there's like a little web connecting a scene in the film or a quote from the movie or something you're seeing in the movie to what's going on in America today. But just a little thread, just another little thread. There's another little thread, right? And nice, man, because it's not heavy-handed. And again, Spike, badass filmmaker. He's not a dummy. He's a fucking genius, right? He knows that he doesn't want to do this to the point where it begins to interfere with the movie, right? He is telling a story. These are characters. This is an engaging plot. It's not much of a plot, really. You know, it's basically they infiltrate this one incident. Sort of the things kind of escalate. They sort of reach a small climax, and then that's basically the movie. Because what Spike Lee's really doing is he's getting into these themes, and he's basically using this setting as a place to get into these themes. But that's where the movie really is. That's what it's really about. And he does a great job of illuminating all these themes. Man, there's one scene where he's got what's his name? Harry Belafonte. Okay, you know, well-known singer and actor, but also a lifelong activist, right? Harry Belafonte, now a very old man, playing a black activist who is on campus at the Black Caucus, you know, building or whatever, talking to the students about, when he was a boy and he saw another black man, you know, a young black kid, get lynched, right? And it's a very harrowing story, and I'm sure that it might be, I don't know if it's true for Harry Belafonte, but I bet you any money that he's reciting, you know, an actual incident that happened that they're referencing. He is talking about that, and then they're intercutting that with a scene of Topher Grace running this ceremony where Adam Driver and his fellow, you know, wannabe Klansmen are basically being knighted, okay? And literally it's this whole crazy ritual with like holy water on their hoods and all this stuff. And that's happening, and then cut to Harry Belafonte talking about the mob, you know, wrapping a chain around this this mentally impaired man's neck who's been convicted of a crime he wasn't fit to be on trial for, because he's clear, you know, that's all this comes out in the story, you know. And they cut back to the Ku Klux Klan and this crazy ritual and all of the sort of overtones of nationalism and of Christianity, you know, which is you know 100% a part of what the Ku Klux Klan identity is about. And then cut back to Harry Belafonte just, you know, talking about hiding during the whole time that incident was happening, because the mob mentality was so insane that he thought if they saw him and they saw his skin, they would do the same thing to him. So it's really, really masterful filmmaking, really, really masterful job of just sort of stitching this movie together with what's going on in the fabric of our social situation nowadays, until the very end of the film. And in the very end of the film, just like in the very beginning, when he starts with such an emphatic sort of move of just quoting another movie, in a sense, at the end of the film, he quotes another film. It's more of a real life news report. Let's say that, you know, he quotes a real life news report, and that's all I'm going to say. But at that moment, he makes it explicit, and by the time we get to that moment, we're very much ready for that moment. And something that might have been less persuasive now becomes something very damning. And man, oh man, it is a really good movie. I would say right now, my 3 favorite films of the year are probably BLACKkKLANSMAN, Sorry to Bother You, and Isle of Dogs. I would say those are the 3 movies I've seen that have really been the ones that I've really enjoyed. So anyway, yeah, so you got to see BLACKkKLANSMAN. Fantastic Spike Lee movie. Spike Lee really kind of at the top of his game. I mean, it's a pretty awesome movie. It's very funny, and it's really good all around. You know, there's the little picky imperfections here and there, but generally speaking, the acting is all really great. I wish I could tell you the young woman who is like the president of the like Black Student Union or whatever. I don't remember the title they used for this group. Who is basically the love interest to John David Washington, but also in many ways she's sort of like the angel on his shoulder who's telling him like, hey, you know, we've got to, you know, who basically just questions him and makes him question whether or not he can be, you know, he can be a police officer and a black man, you know. At the same time, the movie doesn't dive on one side of that question or the other and tell you what it's supposed to be. They let it be a thing where, you know, yeah, these are the characters and this is what they're getting into, and they're different people. And I think ultimately that's an important lesson. I think ultimately, with a lot of the things that are going on in our society nowadays, you know, it's important to remember that the really important thing is the individual, right? That's really where I think we as Americans and we as a country are at our best, when we remember that everybody is a person, and no matter what all the other stuff is that make up the kind of person you might be, at the end of the day, you are a unique person, and your unique person transcends all of these categorizations, you know. And really that's why all those categories are important things to respect, because inside of all that, you're a human being, and you get to be the person that you are, and get to strive to be the person you want to be, you know. And on that note, I'm at the gym, so I'm going to I'm going to go become a better person. And I hope this one works out. I think we're going to be okay. So thank you for checking it out. Check out BLACKkKLANSMAN. It's killer. It's killer. It's fucking killer. If you've seen the movie, let me know. If you like this review, let me know. Like my video, subscribe to my channel. You can follow me at Mighty Joe Nolan on Twitter and on Instagram. And leave a comment. I always love talking to you guys. And tell me what you thought of the review. Tell me what you think of the movie. Tell me what your favorite movies of the year are. I'd love to hear anybody's, best of. We're a little bit past the middle of the year right now, but it's always a good time to just stop and think. Okay, what have we seen? What have we loved? What are our favorite movies thus far before we head in?